Well, hello and good afternoon, everyone. We're going to make a start now, so I hope you are ready and sitting comfortably. So firstly, a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Just like to start by making some introductions, if that's okay. Just so you know who you are listening to, that's me. I'm Karen Lovell, and I am the HR Knowledge Manager for HR Solutions. I am the presenter today. I was going to be accompanied by my colleague Atim. It's actually my good colleague Sue instead today. She's going to be in the background fielding any technical problems that we might have. Hopefully there won't be any, but just in case. She'll also be collating questions that you have. If possible, she will come back to you, but if not, please do send them through anyway. If you don't get an answer, then I will certainly look to respond to you after the webinar. If not during. Okay, so we will be recording this session as ever. So if you did want to listen back, there will be an opportunity for you to do that. And equally, if you did want a copy of the slides, then please do contact us and we'll make them available upon request. Okay, so we are revisiting the ginormous topic of GDPR and particularly compliance. It's become quite apparent to us that people are still really concerned about it. It seems to be this unknown beast, and no matter how much you might try and read up on it, you know, there's so much on the internet at the moment, and it really does become quite confusing. So we just really wanted to cut through it all and help give you, you know, just a fairly standardized guide as to how to approach it. If you haven't seen the webinar that I did in November, there is one that you would be able to see in either online on our YouTube page or on our website, if you have access, which recaps really GDPR and what it's all about. This set of sessions, though, that we will be doing from now and up till May is, as I say, going to be focused on about how you can actually become compliant. Okay, and the first step, as far as I'm concerned, if you want to follow my program, is to get your data audited. So this is going to be the structure for the webinar today. By the end of it, I hope that you'll be able to use these steps as a method by which to audit your personal data. The aims that I have for this webinar is, well, I hope that you will feel a little bit more comfortable at the end of the webinar today. I really do want it to be a fairly comfortable pace for you. I don't want to bog you down with too much, you know, lexically dense jargon and so on and so forth. I just want it to be practical and real. Hopefully you'll understand what's meant by personal data. You hear the word data so many times it loses all meaning, so we'll revisit that and make sure that you're up to speed. I'm also going to explain why I think that completing an audit is important and why it's something that you should look to do first. And as I said, hopefully my steps will leave you feeling that you've got a bit of a strategy that you can take away and practically put into place. So, as I said, I did do a webinar in November, which you're welcome to review, of course. But I do just want to do a little bit of a pit stop, take a deep breath, and just have a quick think about the bare essentials of what GDPR is. So just for anyone who's perhaps been hiding behind Christmas and thinking I'll peep out in New Year and try and get to grips with this. What I really wanted to do is think, okay, if somebody said, in a nutshell, you know, cut the waffle, what is GDPR in a nutshell? What do I need to know? Okay, I've done that. And I've put together a few bullet points as are here. So hopefully this is a recap for anyone who feels like, I know this, thank you very much. And for anyone who's thinking, oh, I really don't, this is for you. So the General data protection regulation, it's just a new law, and it's here to modernise how data is handled in what has become a very digital age, okay? And it's going to apply to all personal data that's processed in the EU. And it's also applicable to any personal data that's processed about a person who resides in the EU, okay? So from that, we can glean that actually this will also be applicable to people abroad, organisations that exist in the US, you know, or any other country who is processing data about an individual who lives in the EU is going to need to be compliant. So there's actually really quite a broad scope. Please do take away from this that in order to process data, you will have to be confident that you have one of the lawful bases for processing data. Okay, so if you don't have one of these lawful bases, then you shouldn't really be collecting, storing, or processing personal data. Now, there are 6 of these. One of them, which I think is going to be most applicable for HR purposes, is legal obligation. Okay, so if you have an obligation you need to adhere to, for example, I need to prove that this individual has the right to work in the UK, then that's going to be a lawful basis for you to obtain a copy of their passport, which of course within it contains quite a lot of personal data. Records of data processing must be kept, okay? So this is not just what you are processing, but how you're processing it as well. You'll also need to report any serious data breaches within 72 hours to the supervisory authority that applies to you. If all of your business decisions are made primarily in the UK, then the supervisory authority for us will be the Information Commissioner's Office. So we're probably all aware of them already, but we will have to report breaches within 72 hours. Now, both records of processing and serious breaches are going to form webinars in themselves in April and May, so do join me to have a look at that in much more detail. Privacy by default and design, again, another webinar that I will be running. So all your data processing must have privacy ingrained within it. If you get a subject access request, you need to be aware that going forwards, they are free for an individual to make. Some circumstances where you might be able to request a fee, but you should otherwise understand that you must not charge a data subject for an access, and you will need to complete it within 1 month. Okay, not the 40 days that we are used to now. It must be completed as soon as reasonably possible, but within 1 month. And lastly, in fear of mirroring the words of Tony Blair some years ago, I'm using the 3s. Security, security, security is what you need to be concerned about with GDPR. Okay, it's all about protecting data against unlawful usage, loss, destruction, protecting data subjects' rights and so on. So you're really going to need to get savvy with how you are securing data, both in a physical sense and technologically as well. So if I can impress nothing else on you today, then hopefully you will remember this. So when you're thinking about data protection, you should really remember, I've skipped forward there, bear with me, that less is more. Okay, so if you can get to grips with this concept, then you'll be winning half the battle. If you're ever in doubt, do I need this? Should I be processing this? Then think, if there's any way in which I can limit it, reduce it, get rid of it, then please do it. And if you were thinking, okay, well, could Brexit be my get out route for my responsibilities here? Then I'm afraid that the answer is a resounding no. No, you can't. Not only is the 25th of May this year, of course, a date when we're still going to be in the EU, but it has also been confirmed that once we do leave the European Union, we are still going to be held accountable and will need to comply with all of the requirements that are in the General Data Protection Regulation, okay? And the reason for this is that our Parliament have drawn up the Data Protection Bill, and it is deliberately been written so that it includes all the requirements and all the same enforcements that GDPR holds, okay? Presumably, you know, the view is that we are whitelisted and may continue to operate normally with this regard to the rest of the member states, okay? And that has been further confirmed by our Information Commissioner Office too. So, sorry, but you've got to sit tight and buckle down. We've got to do this. Now, the key principles of GDPR are something that is well worth being aware of. Now, I don't want to focus on this too much because, again, it's something that we have looked at in the past. But what I did just want to press upon you, you know, is the fact that if you're feeling very daunted by everything that's out there about GDPR and all the horror stories of things that you're going to have to do and so on and so forth, and just thinking this is a real headache, how can I make head and tail of this? If you can digest these principles, okay, and really just try and live and breathe them rather than give them, you know, the cursory nod, then you will be halfway there, okay. As I said before, it's very much the case that less is more, and it's very much the case that the GDPR is trying to make us accountable, okay. As with any piece of law, you should always take into consideration the purpose of its existence, okay? And that's the case again here. The articles that make it up, you know, they're more or less indicators of how to adhere to these principles, okay? Some of them are clear instructions that we'll address through my webinar program, but the rest really is almost common sense things that you might be doing anyway if you were really trying to, as I say, live by these principles. So just bear in mind that the whole point of GDPR is to try and make us accountable for the data that we hold. It wants us to make sure that we're only collecting data for a specific and legitimate purpose. Okay, and that the data that we collect to achieve that is kept to a minimum. So we're really only getting information that we have to have in order to be able to achieve the purpose that we're getting it for. We've got to make sure that it is kept accurate and up to date, okay, which is going to have some bearing on how we audit data. And we must make sure that we are only keeping it in a way that identifies an individual for as long as is necessary. Lastly, we've got to keep it secure and prevent against accidental loss or damage, as I mentioned before. So just to hone in and start to convince you as to why auditing your data is a good idea, I just wanted to highlight that actually almost 4 of the 6 principles of GDPR, in my view anyway, really have something to do with how organised we're going to need to be. Okay, we're going to need to make sure that everything we do is very considered, so that data really is limited to what we actually need, that we are only getting the very minimum amount that we require, as I said before, and then we're keeping it up to date and for as long as we need. Now, if we are not aware of everything that we have in our business or organisation, then how are we going to make sure that we are keeping it with integrity? We're just not going to be able to. Equally, if I move on to the next slide, there are rights that data subjects have or will have that are going to be strengthened by this regulation, and a few of them really do mean that, again, organisation is going to be paramount. If a data subject, for example, asks to have access to their data, as I mentioned, we're going to need to comply fairly promptly. Okay, a month is not necessarily a very long time if you know that you've got bits of data stored all over the place, and that Joe Blogs might have a crucial bit of that information at home and they're on long-term sick, so just being organised, albeit very simple, is going to be really effective in helping you to meet these timescales. And we have other timescales, as I mentioned before. We've got to report breaches within 72 hours. There's certain things we have to do as part of that breach, and being organised where everything we have is going to help us meet that 72-hour turnaround. Our data subjects can also invoke a right to data portability, and that just means that we can provide them the information they've asked for in a common format. So we send it to them in a PDF file, for example, rather than some strange, weird or wonderful format that you might have. And in association with accuracy mentioned before, they have the right to get any data you hold about them updated so that it's correct, and to ask to be forgotten, which we have to do very robustly. Okay, it goes as far as suggesting that we do need to remove data from any backup servers, that you might have. So again, if you don't feel confident that you know exactly where all of your data is, how are you going to be able to update it? How are you going to be able to remove it? And if you're caught out, you're going to fall foul of the penalties, which have really skyrocketed. So let's just get down to some good old-fashioned housekeeping, shall we? All right, so hopefully I've convinced you a complete audit of all personal data in existence in your organisation is going to need to be conducted so that you might be able to properly regulate your own data and take accountability for it. Only then can you really look to get yourself sorted out with the other things that you need to do to be compliant. So, let's just clarify exactly what we mean by data then. It's quite a broad word. It gets chucked around quite a lot, particularly at the moment. So what exactly is it that we have to track and monitor and sort out? Well, put very simply, personal data is any information which relates to a person who could be identified. Okay, so I've tried to make that as straightforward as possible, but the keywords there are person and could. Okay, it's got to be about a natural living person, and regardless of whether or not, as a piece of information on its own, it may not identify an individual. If with a second bit of information it could, then that makes that piece of information personal data. Okay. Now, the definition of personal data has changed a little bit from what it was under the Data Protection Act, but not so much that you really need to be too concerned about the difference. And then we have special category data. So at the moment, we commonly refer to this as sensitive data. In the GDPR, it's referred to as special category data, but I think we're probably going to continue to be referring to it as sensitive as well. In short, it's any personal data that is likely to be private to an individual or may be used to discriminate against an individual. Okay, now I've put on screen there the characteristics that the GDPR specifically states as special category. It's interesting that it doesn't reflect everything that's in the Equality Act, but nonetheless, I think that the phrase there, that any data that could be private, really suggests that we've got a catch-all there for any data, as I say, that could be protected characteristic or give an indication of that, really. In essence, then, personal data and special category data hasn't really changed, but this is the sort of information we're talking about when we're discussing GDPR and our obligations. So, stage one, step one, before we start, let's get everybody engaged in what we've got to do. Why? Well, you are only ever as strong as your weakest link, aren't you? If you've got somebody, you know, in your organization who hasn't got a clue, is walking around, you know, leaving passwords written down, leaving security coded doors wide open and telling Joe Blogs on the phone, you know, who's in and out of your business and what security software you use, you know, all your best efforts in the world are going to be completely to waste. So you're going to need to get everyone involved. They're probably going to think it's a bore, you know, so try and think of ways that you can make it interesting. There's some really great tools online provided by the ICO with posters and things like that that you can put up. Little signs, for example, that say you didn't take information security seriously, that you can use and put on people's desks and things like that if they leave the computer unlocked. Just try and think of ways that you can get engagement of your staff, because it is going to be really important. And as I say, you don't want all your hard work to go to waste. You might particularly feel, though, that you're going to need to solicit some support from some of your key colleagues. So it's well worth you thinking about who that's going to apply to. So as I said before, you know, who is this going to be applicable to? Well, everyone. You need the buy-in of everybody. But key groups that you're going to start with are a board, if you have a board, a legal team, your HR teams, your CEO, finance teams. If you've got team leaders, you'll need to engage with them so that they can try and spread the message as passionately as you, and your IT company or department. These guys are really going to become our best friends, I think, if they aren't already. So do make nice. These people, I think you're going to need to have the most passion and engagement from, because without it coming from them, you know, what chance do you have of anybody else really feeling like it's their responsibility to keep the business compliant? So I've done you a little bit of a checklist, okay? When preparing to try and get buy-in from staff, you know, it might be well worth you trying to plan, you know, how you're going to tackle this. I have put together a bit of a toolkit to help our clients to tackle these stages, and as part of that, you know, for example, I've put together a form that thinks about how we're going to get staff engaged and making sure that we've got everyone so no one slips out of the net. But in a nutshell, you might want to start by thinking about, right, what departments do we have, if you're large enough to have departments, that regularly handle personal data? Okay, then think about an appropriate training log, maybe develop something that you can keep so that it is evidence of the training that you've put in place. We'll talk in future on our third webinar about measures that you put in place to prove that you're trying to be compliant, and certainly having records of training is going to be a measure you can have. So one step ahead if you can do that now. You might want to then think about targeting the actual heads of these departments and any other roles that you might have who are going to be responsible for regular use of personal data. And then look at asking these people to go away and think about where their data might be. Now, again, you might want to have a tool to prompt them to do this and to think about where their data might be, not necessarily all the obvious places. So we'll look at that in a little bit more detail in a moment. And then whilst we're on the topic of getting buy-in from people, it's going to be very well worth you doing it at this stage to step outside your organisation and think about any third parties that you might be sharing data with. Okay, now, I mean, you can do this at any point, of course, between now and May 25th, but I would suggest you do it now as part of getting buy-in, because you really want to feel confident that everybody that you have relations with is on board with becoming GDPR compliant. Okay, not only because you would, you know, if you were checked, you would have to provide evidence that you have tried to reasonably assure yourselves that your third parties that you're sharing your data with are also GDPR compliant. Okay, and if you can't do that, you're going to be held liable for sharing that information, right? So contact them now, and I'm thinking pension providers, if you've got any employee database systems, you know, that you use as a third party, or payroll databases, for example. Any employee assistance programs, are they're probably quite good, to be honest. Get in touch, okay? If particularly as well, if you've got any online storage companies that you use, you might want to contact them, because it's surprising how many people are still not really actually able to say to you, this is what I'm doing about GDPR. Okay, so if you don't get these reassurances, you're going to need to step away from them, and that might mean getting new providers. So that's why I'd really start to think about doing this now rather than later. A note on how you can adequately get assurances. Again, I've addressed this in my webinar in November if you want to search for it, but essentially look for EU Data Protection Board accredited organisations, EU data accredited standards which organisations can obtain. There's very few available at the moment, but they will be out there, so it's certainly something you should look out for. And then keep evidence that you've got that information, because again, you might need to be able to prove that you've done this in the future. Okay. So hopefully now then, we've got everybody thinking about their responsibilities, and got to be chomping at the bit, aren't they, to try and get sorted for you. So where then are we looking? Well, why do I need to think about where my data is? I know where it is. It's on my computer. It's in that filing cabinet. Well, is it really? If you don't know where all of the pieces of your data are, then how are you going to control it? Okay, so once you have your team rallied, I really would suggest, particularly if they're responsible for their own parts of the business, that you ask them to go away and complete, as I say, some sort of tool or form that gets them to start documenting and really thinking about where they and their staff might be keeping, hiding data. Okay. And I've done a bit of an exercise here of starting to think where data might be. It mirrors some forms that, as I say, I've created. So first of all, you might want to prompt them to think about sources of personal data, just to start getting the juices flowing. So CVs and references, you know, those documents are going to be sources of data with loads and loads of personal information on it. Of course, your personnel files, medical records, you know, they're going to have a wealth of information on there, aren't they? Things about disabilities and absences and who your doctor is and what conditions you've got and so on and so forth. And then think about where these documents might actually be in the world. Okay, so if you have got international offices, then start thinking, because they've got to be GDPR compliant as well, and they might not care, you know, that you guys in GB have got to start doing this. Well, actually, you need to start doing it too. If you've got anyone that works at home, you know, do you know where at home they're keeping their documents? Maybe not. And if it's not kept securely and they have a breach, you're going to have to answer for that. So start getting savvy with that. If you've got anyone who might be stuffing files in the back of their car or has got boxes in the boot, you know, dig it out. And this is what I mean by thinking, you know, it is important for you to really start to be realistic about where data is, because it could be all over the place. You know, if you've got satellite shops, for example, you might each have a shop manager who's got a filing cabinet with copies of files in that you didn't even know about. So you really want everyone to get involved and start coming up with the goods. And then where in that location is it? So, you know, if you've got any sensitive documents that people are just chucking in the bin, you know, still not perhaps used to a shredder, have you got duplications of documents in email folders as well as your filing cabinets? Have you got any old USB sticks or even floppy disks that are lying around somewhere, you know, that have got people's redundancy information on it? These are all places that we might need to start sweeping up. And I think it's really important to think about who's got access to all these places as well, okay? Because think about whether or not it's easy for the sandwich man to walk into your business and read a sick note that might be left on somebody's desk on the side. Yeah? Hopefully, some of you are thinking, well, that would never happen in my business, and good for you. That's great. Certainly we all aspire to be like you. But realistically, I think many people think, hand on heart, yep, you know, it could be that the printer maintenance guy walks in and could see all sorts of things. And if that's the case, then we need to start rethinking about who's got access. Now, again, something we'll think a little bit more about in my third webinar, but for the purposes of getting audited and getting organised, let's just think about where we're keeping things in terms of who's got access. All right. So again, another little checklist. So maybe think about giving staff who are going to help you with auditing a tool to prompt them to think about everywhere that their data could be so they can really account for it all. Get them to do it comprehensively, as I've said, and realistically. Don't just do hypothetically, you know. Yep, you might, in theory, have a really great policy for how that you obtain and store sick notes, but if they don't actually happen, you know, if they do get left in someone's in tray until someone's back from holiday, then that's what we need to know. How long could a document ever be left sat somewhere for, you know? Could it be in the back of someone's car for a bit? Could it be sat in a bin that could easily be accessed by somebody walking past? And then if you have got everyone to fill in a form such as this, just collate them and go through and just sense check to make sure that no apparent areas have been missed, okay? If you know that Joe Bloggs works at home and they've not put where they keep things that are at home, then ask them to have a think about that and be honest with you. Honesty is the best policy, you know, we're doing it now so that we can put things in place if we need to. So now, hopefully the good bit, it might still pose a bit of a headache for some people, but hopefully as you start being able to say goodbye to bits and bobs, that you'll start feeling a load lifting, and wouldn't that be nice? So it's New Year, let's do a spring clean, get rid of what you don't need. But why do I need to do that? If you're anything like me, I'm very much somebody who is used to keeping every single email that I get from an employee or a manager in case, you know, as a HR person, I'm going to need to fall back and rely on that. Or if, you know, have to defend in tribunal, then we need to be able to show conversation that we have and have that all important paper trail. So what does GDPR mean for this? Well, it is upsetting people. It upset me, but think about how much better you will feel if you've got, a tidy back of house. It is going to make you feel that much lighter, that much more in control, and that's what we need to be. Now, there are reasons why we have to do this as well. We're obligated to erase data once we no longer need it for the purpose. Okay, so get rid of it now. There may well be quite a lot of things that you have no requirement for anymore, so get rid. You may also have to communicate any erasure of personal data to any recipients that you have shared the data with, okay, as of the 25th of May. Now, that in itself could be quite a significant administration task. So if you can get rid of what you don't need now, that's potentially going to save you quite a lot of man hours in contacting individuals and trying to get them to reassure you that they are deleting it as well. Okay. And of course, if we think back to the principles that I had on screen at the very beginning about purpose limitation and data minimizing, actually, if you strip out what you don't need now, you're meeting 3, if not 4, of the 6 principles of GDPR just by getting rid of everything you don't need anymore. Okay, so auditing and stripping out what you don't need is a massive step towards compliance. You're going to feel a lot better at the end of it, I hope. And it's going to set you up to be able to meet your other obligations, as I said, which we'll discuss in the next coming seminars. Now, if you have any documents and you think, I really can't get rid of this, I really need it, then the GDPR prompts you to think about pseudonymizing. And I've practiced saying that word. Really is a mouthful. For those of you that don't know or haven't had the delight of this word before in your vocabulary, it means processing of personal data in such a manner that the personal data can no longer be attributed to a specific data subject. Okay? So provided that the data that you have, okay, is protected, and that if on its own it doesn't identify an individual, but perhaps with another piece of data that's kept somewhere completely separate and is also kept securely, it could identify them, then you have pseudonymized your data. All right, so let's put this in realistic terms. Quite often, organisations, particularly those with HR departments, will create reports on employee turnover or disciplinary cases, sickness absence, and so on and so forth. Now, if you're opening up an Excel spreadsheet, almost by default, it used to be that you would put an employee's name down the left-hand side, right? You might put their start date as well, maybe their age, length of service, so on and so forth. Okay, now, do you necessarily need all that information just to report on employee turnover? Maybe not. Maybe if you're doing month to month or, a year review, maybe you do want to know an individual's name in case you are trying to, look at any real specific details. But if you are just looking at trends and numbers, certainly it's going to become the case that you perhaps don't even need to know the name of the individual that left. You might just be tracking when people tend to leave or the reasons that were given. You don't need to know if it was Joe Bloggs, or Sally Brown or whoever it is. So when you're thinking about getting rid of what you don't need, it might also include thinking about reports that you have. Can I get rid of any identifiers? And again, a step in the future, but prompts you to perhaps start thinking, well, actually, I've got a new starter form here. It's got all kinds of requests for information that not necessarily is needed or is needed by all the same people. You know, do payroll need to know who your next of kin is, for example? So this will start prompting us to think about measures we'll put in place in future as well. So destruction and retention. So talk about retention in just a moment, but if I just look at destruction for now, if a data subject were to say, I want you to completely remove all of my data, I want to be forgotten, then unless you have another legal basis other than consent to keep that information, then you will need to make sure that you are suitably destroying and erasing that data so that it is irrevocable. Okay, taking into account reasonableness of what technology you've got available to you to do that. But as I said, it does suggest that organisations that can afford to or ought to be able to would need to even remove any copies from any backup servers. Okay, so as I said before, think about these principles, go as far as you reasonably can to make sure that you are adhering to them, because you really do need to. If you were to fall foul, there are really significant penalties, financial penalties that we all face as well. I've discussed previously. And, you know, particularly if you are getting a request from a data subject, in the context of HR, it's probably going to be an employee, probably going to be an employee who's got a grievance, call me a cynic, probably going to be an employee who is resigning or has resigned, again, call me a cynic, but they tend to be the subject access requests I used to get, and my clients certainly get at those times. So I think that GDPR is going to become much more, you know, televised. People are going to become much more aware of their rights, and so anything that an employee might be able to request or check upon, if you've not done it right, they're going to be all the more savvy as to what they can do about it and, you know, how they can seek compensation. So you need to try and get it right as far as possible. Another reason why it might well be worth of getting rid of what you don't need now, of course, too. So in terms of thinking about when we might actually get rid of something, we want to know, how long should I keep it for? When do I destroy it? Is there any guidance from GDPR about how long I can keep certain documents for? Well, I'm afraid the answer is no. That might be music to your ears, or it might actually be really frustrating. I find it frustrating, but I suppose it does just reinforce the fact that they really are wanting us to be very much accountable for ourselves. So I think it's well worth drawing up a document, as I say, to perhaps prompt people in your business to think about when we need things. Okay, so any specific nuances that you might have, you know, you can take those into account here. That is to say that you shouldn't still be aware of some legislation that we have. We do have some authorities, and I've given you some examples here on the screen. Again, we do have tools on this if anyone is interested in getting in touch for more support. But for example, we've got some acts such as the Limitation Act, which says we need to keep personnel files for 6 years after employment. Now you can see that was written in 1980. Okay, the internet wasn't even in existence at that point. You know, it wasn't until 95 that that came in, and we're, you know, so far ahead of that now that we've had to have this new regulation written to keep up with it. So I fully expect or hope that the EU board are going to release some further guidance, or perhaps even Theresa May might, as part of the data protection bill, we might get some announcements about that, certainly for poor old employers. We do have some scope of flexibility written into the regulation, but it really is incredibly vague paragraph that suggests that it acknowledges we might have some additional requirements than is permitted by this regulation. So that's great. But as I say, key ones to be aware of, okay, health and safety documents, you've got to keep those for 40 years. Discipline and grievance records, we've taken some indication from the GP regulations here, and we're looking at maybe keeping those sorts of things for 2 years. So if I can expand on this, because it's quite a good example as to thinking about the purpose. Now, many of you might think, well, hang on a minute, I'm going to issue a final written warning to somebody. I only would really normally issue that for a 12-month period. Surely I can get rid of the warning at that point. Well, yeah, you might want to. There's some scope even to suggest that you might be able to keep it for 6 years after employment. But certainly if you really wanted to live and breathe, you know, keeping things to a minimum, you might want to have some sort of way in which you can sift out documents that you don't need anymore, and something with a clear expiry date might be an easy point to start, right? Well, yeah, absolutely. But you might think, well, I really just want to hold on to this a little bit longer, and if you can justify it, then do. With disciplinary warnings, and I do want you to listen to my phrasing carefully here if this is new information for you particularly. We do have case law which demonstrated that we may refer back to previous expired disciplinary warnings, but we may not rely upon previous warnings upon which to build a warning. Okay, so if you've got a written warning that's expired, you can't justify going to a final written warning based on the fact that this person had an expired written warning previously, okay? But if there were, for example, doubt about a person's intention and you've got 3 or 4 disciplinary warnings that are all about lateness and absence, for example, then it might be that you can use that to suggest, well, is this person just running us around the houses? Yes, probably, because look at all these flimsy reasons for lateness and absence we were given previously. So why not put together a bit of a table? You can use the audit, the exercise that you did before in thinking about where all your data is and what sources of data you have, to almost create a column down the left hand side, and then think about your justification for how long you want to keep that for. Of course, on a case-by-case basis, you might want to adapt it, particularly if you've got a rogue individual who perhaps has a pattern of accruing warnings that expire and then they start again. So in that individual's case, you know, of course, you'd be justified to keep him a little bit longer. Just a few thoughts here on screen of things then that you might be able to do after you've had a sandwich after this webinar. Why not go and clear out all the old CVs and application forms from people who weren't successful in applying to your business? Any old references, you know, from people that have been with you for a year or more? Do you really need their references anymore? Probably not, no. Trainee records from years ago, get rid of it. In the same logic, flexible working requests, you know, you might want to let go of those after 2 years. If you have got anything, though, that could be used as evidence of a breach of contract, you might want to consider the fact that a breach of contract claim can be made within 6 years of a breach. So anything specific to a contractual term, you might be justified in keeping for a lot longer. And then again, just another checklist. So when you're thinking about what you can go and get rid of, I'd do it in this order. So can I get rid of it completely? If yes, do it. If not, move to step number 2. Have we got any copies that could be removed if we just keep the original? So very many of us seem to have both a hard copy somewhere, a soft copy on our computers, and maybe even a copy in our emails from when we've sent it to someone else. Might even have a copy, you know, on a disk or a USB stick, as I say before. If you're trying to meet the principle of minimization, you probably unlikely to need those data pieces in 4 different places. Try and make it so that you reduce the number of copies as far as reasonably possible, and perhaps then think about a central location where anyone that needs access can get it. Move on then to the third step. So if I can't erase it, can I remove copies that aren't needed anymore? And of what I have, can I strip out any bits of information about a person so that we can complete the principle of pseudonymizing? Again, take into account the feasibility of this. So if I go back to my Excel spreadsheet, it might be fairly straightforward for you to run through and just right click, on the A column and get rid of that. Fine. I'm not suggesting that you get a black marker and go through every, letter and scrub out all of the names and addresses, And then failing all of that, do you need to retain it? And if you do need to retain it, then I would suggest that you think of your justification for this, particularly if you are soliciting the support of any of your colleagues in doing so, because it might just prompt them again to start thinking about, am I just keeping it because it's easier to keep it and get on with all the other things I have to do today? Or do I actually feel, yeah, I need this because X, Y, and Z. If I was challenged, I could justify it. So last but not least, sorting out what you've got left. So hopefully when you reach this step, you'll be in a position where you understand exactly what sorts of data you've got in your organisation, what sources of it there are, where it's kept, and maybe even who's got access to it at this point. And you might be feeling like you've had a load lifted, having just shredded or burned lots of documents that you've got and had a nice barbecue. So you're feeling great. And so now, in true spirit of entering into the new year and spring cleaning, you might want to start organising what you've got left. And I know it might sound really obvious, yeah, I've got to organise the data I've got, but if you don't, you're just not going to be able to control it. You've got yourself to this point. You need a system that's clear and easy to understand, so that any new starters as well as existing staff, are dissuaded from making duplications, know where to go to get the data, know that it should only be kept in X place. And know where to go so that they can update it if need be, or erase it if need be. And you can know that by going to that 1 or maybe 2 places and having erased it, then it's done, and you've met that right to erasure. So let's get organised. If we don't, that horrible phrase, fail to prepare, prepared to fail, it's a bit nasty, but it's so true. So I've done a bit of a tick list again, particularly if you are thinking about getting support from your colleagues. So ask them to consider how they're going to organise each of their data sources. If they've got a method already that works, then that's great. I mentioned privacy by design, and as I said in my third session, we will think about implementing measures, and that might mean reassessing how you organise things. So if they do want to start considering security now, they're going to be a step ahead. When they're considering how you organise your data, take into consideration, as I said before, who's got access or who needs access, okay? Remove access from those who do not need it. And try and think about where a convenient place might be that all those who need access can get hold of it locally, and as I say, in as few places as possible. It should be clear, that if there is any restricted access in the way that you store data, that it is restricted. And as I mentioned, it should really try and dissuade people from creating duplications. if it's possible to automate any processing, then try and consider that as well. So it might be that you can obtain a software program, or you might be aware of certain tools online, for example, that will help you to date stamp files and things like that. So actually, you might have decided how long we're going to retain things for before we destroy them. Can you then perhaps get a piece of software that can do that for you? You know, this warning will expire after 12 months. It should be removed from the system and servers after 24, you know? Wouldn't that be great? Technology has pretty much got us into this this mess, hence why we need to protect our data a lot more in a much more savvy way than we did previously. So let's use technology to help us as well. It's probably going to be our best friend, particularly with security. And then just identify any other factors that might be a nuance to your business that are going to impact how it's most effective for you to store your personal data. Okay. If, as I said, you did have staff that you're bringing on board to help you do this, again, it might feel like you're mollycoddling, but why not help them to prompt to think about this by giving them some sort of form. We have this as part of our toolkit, but you want to prompt them to think about where the data is sourced, who needs access, can it be automated, how and where it's stored, and what considerations. And again, I'd perhaps just have a column that you prompt them to justify how they're going to be organising it going forwards too. So that takes us right up to, if not slightly over, our hour. So I'm going to end the presentation here today. I do hope that you have been sending through your questions, and I'm sure my colleague will have been doing her best to get back to you if she can. But certainly, if there have been any that we haven't answered, or you think of any afterwards, please feel free to pop them over. I'd be more than happy to have a look at them and come back to you by email. You can contact us on this number here if you did want to speak to anybody directly, an advisor or a consultant. And you can also send along inquiries to our email address at hrsolutions-uk.com and visit us on www.hrsolutions-uk.com. I do like to have feedback, particularly on content and delivery, so that I know that I'm communicating the sorts of things you're interested in a way that you find engaging, informative. So please do feel free to give me some constructive feedback. That would be great. And thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. I do hope that it's been helpful and you feel like you've got some things you can practically go away and do now. And I really hope that you'll join me for the second one next month, where you'll be in a better place. All right. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.